This month, Russia absorbed one of the most devastating blows it has suffered since the first armored columns rolled across Ukraine's borders. But this time, it wasn't the thunder of HIMARS rockets, the howl of cruise missiles, or the grinding advance of tanks across the battlefield that delivered the strike. Instead, the weapon was colder, quieter, and infinitely more calculated. The strike came from bureaucrats in London and Brussels, armed not with rifles but with spreadsheets, not with artillery but with maritime law. Behind closed doors and sealed meeting chambers, the United Kingdom and the European Union launched another coordinated offensive against the Kremlin's Lifeline. Not on the battlefield, but at sea, where Russia's so-called shadow fleet, the ghost armada of rusting oil tankers, has been sustaining Moscow's war chest in defiance of sanctions. It is a form of modern warfare that doesn't leave craters or smoke plumes, but it threatens to choke the oxygen out of Russia's economy, starving one of the largest militaries on Earth without firing a single shot. This latest strike, announced in July 2025, is not just another sanctions package. It is a direct assault on the arteries keeping Vladimir Putin's war machine alive. And if the West has its way, it could mark the beginning of the end for Russia's shadow fleet, and with it, the Kremlin's ability to finance its war in Ukraine. It began on July 18th when the European Union dropped what can only be described as an economic bombshell. For months, diplomats had been negotiating in backrooms, preparing the EU's 18th sanctions package. On paper, it looked like more of the same. More names on lists, more ships blacklisted, more companies sanctioned. But buried in the language was a change that fundamentally rewrote the rules of the game: the creation of a dynamic oil price cap. Until now, Europe had enforced a static cap of $60 per barrel on Russian crude. But markets evolve, and Russia had found ways to maneuver around the fixed price. The new system was different, adaptive, fluid, and impossible to pin down. It linked the price of Russian oil exports directly to market conditions, tightening whenever Moscow tried to cheat the system. Starting September 3rd, the cap would automatically drop to $47.60 per barrel. That's not a minor adjustment. It's one of the steepest enforced cuts in modern economic history, and it applied only to Russian oil and to countries buying Russian-linked crude. The message was clear. The economic battlefield now had a new weapon, and it was aimed directly at Moscow's wallet. But the EU strike was just the opening salvo. 3 days later, London unleashed something far bigger. On July 21st, Britain's newly appointed Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, strode to a podium and announced the largest maritime sanctions package in the nation's history. His words were not rhetoric, they were targeted fire. The UK had identified 2 companies and 135 vessels that together had carried billions of dollars worth of Russian oil since the start of 2024. And now, in one sweeping move, Britain was cutting them off from the global financial system. These were not random choices. British intelligence had spent months tracing the movements of tankers that thought they were invisible. Using advanced tracking systems, maritime surveillance satellites, and AI-driven detection, they exposed how Russia's so-called ghost ships had been slipping through cracks in enforcement, turning off their transponders, and going dark. Now, their cover was blown. The 2 companies at the center of the sanctions revealed just how Moscow built its Lifeline. Intershipping Services LLC, a little-known firm responsible for registering Russian vessels under Gabonese flags, suddenly found itself cut off. This single entity had facilitated as much as $10 billion annually in Russian goods transport, disguising the true ownership of Moscow's fleet under a thin veneer of African paperwork. Then there was Litasco Middle East, a Dubai-based subsidiary of Lukoil, Russia's third-largest energy company. Once operating in over 30 countries, Lukoil's empire has withered under sanctions, reduced to barely a dozen. With London's move, one of its last remaining arteries was severed. Its tankers could no longer access maritime services that kept them afloat. The timing of this strike was brutal. Russia is entering peak shipping season for winter fuel deliveries to Asia. And now, with hundreds of vessels either blacklisted or under suspicion, the logistics web is tightening. According to estimates, 444 ships are directly affected. That's not just inconvenience, that's paralysis. To understand why this hit Moscow so hard, you need to understand what the Shadow Fleet really is. Born in 2022 as Western sanctions first bit into Russia's oil revenues, the fleet became a vast, floating smokescreen. It was a desperate solution to a desperate problem: how to keep crude oil flowing to buyers willing to defy Western restrictions. The answer was to disappear into the fog of international shipping, exploiting loopholes in maritime law. Russia already commanded one of the world's largest merchant navies, but not every ship was fit for the job. The ideal ghost tanker was between 15 and 25 years old enough to blend in with the planet's aging fleet, but not so old that it would break down mid-voyage. These ships were reflagged under so-called flags of convenience, in places where oversight was weak, paperwork was easy, and corruption was cheap. Gabon became a favorite. Its registry churned out shadow identities for vessels that, on paper, were suddenly African, renamed with neutral-sounding titles, and scrubbed of their Russian heritage. From there, the deception deepened. The tankers would disable their AIS, an act known as going dark, vanishing from global tracking systems for days or weeks. Out in international waters, beyond any Coast Guard's jurisdiction, they would meet other tankers and conduct ship-to-ship transfers. Barrels of crude would flow across hoses from one ship to another, muddying the trail until what began as Russian oil became, on paper, Maltese or Gabonese. And insurance, the legal requirement for any ship to dock at a port, was conjured up through Moscow's allies. Since legitimate Western insurers refused to touch them, Russian tankers turned to makeshift coverage from firms in Kazakhstan or Kyrgyzstan, landlocked nations with no real maritime tradition, but suddenly transformed into insurance hubs on paper. The coverage was often worthless, but it was enough to bluff their way into harbors. By 2025, the Shadow Fleet had grown enormous. Intelligence firms estimated more than 1,100 ships actively engaged in sanctions evasion, with another 900 in the gray zone. Combined, they represented nearly 17% of global oil trade, a staggering number that revealed just how much Russia depended on this shadow network. And it worked. In 2024, the Shadow Fleet helped Moscow rake in nearly $10 billion in extra revenue above what sanctions would have allowed. That alone equaled about 15% of Russia's pre-war military budget, enough to fuel the war for months at a time. For Putin, it was a lifeline. But every shadow operation carries a hidden cost. Shipping oil to India or China takes far longer than selling it to Europe. Each barrel comes with $10 to $15 in added transport costs. Buyers demand steep discounts for the sanctions risk. Shipping times stretch into weeks instead of days. For a nation exporting 5 million barrels a day, each dollar shaved off means 5 million lost daily. The Kremlin's own budget tells the story. In 2025, military spending has ballooned to $142 billion, roughly a third of the federal budget. Defense and security together consume over 40%. Infrastructure, education, healthcare, starved. The unemployment rate, officially 2.3%, is a mirage. In reality, the country is hollowing out as workers are pulled into the army or flee abroad. Now, with the EU's new price cap slashing the value of Russian crude, the squeeze is tightening. If Moscow shifts more oil to India or China, it faces even greater shipping costs. And those countries know it. With Europe cutting itself off, Beijing and New Delhi hold the cards, demanding steeper discounts because they have nowhere else to sell. Meanwhile, Ukraine is striking Russia's refineries and pipelines directly, disrupting even the overland routes. And if hundreds of shadow vessels are knocked out by sanctions, Russia faces not just lost profits, but a logistics crisis, right as demand peaks for winter energy. The dynamic cap ensures that every attempt at evasion only backfires. If Moscow tries to game the market, the cap adjusts downward. A death spiral, where Russian oil becomes less competitive with each maneuver. Even China's banks are backing away. By late 2024, nearly all Chinese banks refused direct Russian transactions, fearing secondary sanctions. Moscow is forced into expensive back channels that eat into its margins. And all of this is just one more link in a chain. This is the 18th EU sanctions package. Each adds complexity, risk, and cost to shadow operations. The fleet is aging, insurers are folding, and enforcement is sharpening. Advanced AI now tracks anomalies in real time. Britain's Nordic Warden operation monitors the North Sea and Baltic with satellites, thermal imagery, and predictive analytics. Windward Maritime AI cross-references ship movements, financial records, even thermal wake signatures, identifying tankers even when they think they've disappeared. Russia is scrambling to fight back. Some ships now carry multiple transponders, flicking them on and off to create false trails. Others broadcast spoofed GPS data, pretending to be thousands of miles away. But these tricks only create more fingerprints. AI detects the inconsistencies, flagging them faster than human analysts ever could. The technological race is tilting sharply toward enforcement. And that's the nightmare for Moscow. The shadow fleet is no longer invisible. Every month, the noose tightens. International cooperation grows. The REPIO task force, linking the US, EU, UK, Canada, Japan, and Australia, shares intelligence instantly across borders. A ship identified in Dubai one week can be blacklisted globally the next. The Nordic-Baltic Alliance secures undersea infrastructure and monitors sea lanes. Piece by piece, the loopholes are closing. As autumn 2025 approaches, the sanctions are designed to hit full force, and they are only likely to expand. Russia's war effort, already resembling a slow war of attrition, faces a question of time. Will sanctions choke the lifeline before the Kremlin's economy collapses into desperation? One thing is certain. For the first time in history, a nation's vast military might is being crippled not by bombs, but by bureaucracy. By lawyers, accountants, and intelligence analysts wielding sanctions like precision-guided weapons. This is the new face of warfare, one where a fleet of ghost ships can be dismantled without a single missile launched. And for Russia, the clock is ticking.